What it is, people, my name is Batman, and I think Battlefield's golden age is dawning. This 32v32 60 frames per second intensity on consoles is just revolutionary, and at this current state, I don't see how Call of Duty can compete. And if you're trying to decide which game you want to buy, or maybe you're a Call of Duty player who hasn't bought Ghost yet, please just hear me out before you make any further decisions. Alright, now this isn't a full declaration of victory for an entire franchise. This isn't based on past games. This isn't based on the two very different formulas these games have built over the years. This is very simply a one-on-one, one game compared to the other comparison. And let me be blunt from the beginning, I'm so not interested in fanboy wars right now. If you get that emotionally worked up over a product that you have no stake in other than you buy it, you have daddy issues that you need to work out with a therapist. It's okay, I have them too, but we're not 5-year-olds anymore, alright? You need to keep that shit to yourself. You let it knot up in a ball inside of you until you finally snap and blow your diet at KFC when you're 40. But seriously, if you take offense at Call of Duty criticism, it means you have adopted this external product being sold to you as a part of your personality. You take it personally. Think about how psychologically warped you must be for that to happen. So you give your dad a call, you see if you can work this stuff out. Now, let me also be blunt about the fact that I have put more time and money into the Call of Duty franchise than you have. I guarantee it. I've built a YouTube channel largely around Call of Duty. I have been a Call of Duty fanboy. I have a best friend who is a Battlefield fanboy, and we have gotten in vicious arguments about which game is better to the point that it threatened our friendship. And in the end, I have to side with him. You think I wanted this? Call of Duty, you think this is easy? You did this, Shane! Not me! This is you! Not me! So if anyone should take it personally, it's me. But I don't. What I do take personally is that a series I love is being shit on by incompetent developers. It's an abusive relationship, and if they don't get their fucking act together, I am moving on. Because Battlefield has been wooing me for the last 3 years, and at this point, Battlefield is a significantly superior game to Ghost. Now, I knew this was going to be the case on the new gen consoles because Call of Duty had to design a game that would see a majority of its sales on the 360 and PS3. That means they could not really take advantage at all of the new gen system capabilities, whereas Battlefield would finally be able to run its full game on new gen, not that watered down 30 frames per second 12v12 bullshit. And I actually thought, and still think, that Battlefield sales would have been much closer to Call of Duty's on pre-gen if not for the fact that Battlefield was so handicapped on the 360 and PS3. So on the new consoles, it was always going to be a new gen game versus an old gen game. Obviously, the new gen superpowers take the day. That's what I thought months ago, and I was right. But what has really surprised me is how Infinity Ward screwed the pooch. So I played Battlefield 3 on the PC where it wasn't watered down at all pretty extensively, along with Black Ops 2 on the console at the same time. And back then, I basically saw it as an apples and oranges thing, right? I would play COD till I got burned out on it and then switch to Battlefield, but eventually I'd burn out on that as well and switch back. And back then, there were things that I preferred on Call of Duty, mainly the simplicity, which is something that I think a lot of people don't realize is COD's biggest appeal. I think people see that as simplicity as a negative, but really it's what has made COD so successful, whereas the appeal for Battlefield has always been in the depth and variety of its gameplay. But with that comes some complexity. COD is kind of like a Star Wars comic book, whereas Battlefield is like a Star Wars novel. Each has its pros and cons. From an objective standpoint, each had an appeal that generated significant revenue. And I personally liked both for separate reasons. And I figured that's how it would continue to be with Battlefield 4 and Ghost. I wouldn't split in either direction all the way. There would still be an apples and oranges, comic books and novels, worthwhile appeal, splitting evenly among the two. But frankly, at this point, I am definitely shifting in the Battlefield 4 direction, decisively. Now, on these new gen consoles and the PC, obviously, there are a number of things that Battlefield has done wonderfully that Call of Duty hasn't even really done at all. And I do want to talk about those comparisons, but even then it would probably still be an apples and oranges thing to me. The novel is a great novel, but the comic book is still a comic book. And I probably wouldn't be making this video. The tipping point for me is that this year, the comic book forgot to include pictures, okay? And I don't want to spend the whole video dissecting Ghost's failures at this point. I've actually dedicated like 10 other videos to that. But what is worth mentioning is how fucking ironic it is that Ghost's biggest flaw is like a copy and paste of Battlefield 3's biggest flaw on consoles. The reason The reason Battlefield has had so much trouble gaining traction on the console platforms is because of how handicapped it was on the 360 and PS3. The 30 frames per second sucked ass, obviously, but the real problem was 12v12 lobbies on maps designed for 32v32. It was basically game breaking. Not so much on maps like Operation Metro, but Operation Firestorm, for example, which was a lot of fun on PC, so much so that it was one of the maps brought back for Battlefield 4, but it was an absolutely broken map on 12v12 consoles. Because that map was considered big even for 32v32, right? It was in the same category of maps as like Caspian Border, just huge wide open terrain with a vehicular gameplay emphasis, but it was just too big for such a low amount of players on consoles. You could very easily end up playing a 30-minute conquest match, only getting 10 kills. If everyone on both teams was playing that OBJ really aggressively, you could have a fast-paced match, but that became a rare occurrence after the first 6 months the game was out. And that was around the time I decided to get it for PC, because I concluded pretty early that the game was obviously not meant for consoles, and it wasn't. For the previous generation of consoles anyways. And so the tragic irony is that's exactly how I feel about Ghosts now. 6v6 does not work on Call of Duty Ghosts. This is the most slow-paced Call of Duty I've ever seen. Now I know part of that was planned, but I also think part of it was a mistake, and I'm going to dissect that much further in future commentaries, but basically to sum it up, IW has tried to recreate the success of MW2. They did this by implementing an emphasis on defensive gameplay that would empower newer and/or casual players, and I'm not saying playing defensively is the sign of a bad player, but I am saying that it's easier to learn and easier to do consistently than rushing. And I also think they designed the map so that every player would be alive for a certain amount of time. If you'll recall, back during Black Ops 1, Treyarch said their goal was giving every player at least 3 seconds of life, right? Because players hate taking a lot of rapid deaths, so they gave them that 3 seconds to prevent that. Now, it pissed people off when they said that, so I don't think they're going to say it again, but I think that's what they've done in Ghosts, is tried to make sure that after every death you have a certain amount of time, maybe 3 seconds, maybe even more, to get your shit together, to get your tent set up. So that part, I think, was planned, but the actual result, this uber slow pace that is pissing people off, I think that was a mistake. Because you have to remember that although they have the same name, these are not the people who created MW2. Everyone involved with MW2 was fired or quit. So these fucking noobs are trying to recreate this game that they didn't actually create. They don't know what they're doing. And it's a two-part error. The first being that when Black Ops 1 wanted people to stay alive for at least 3 seconds, they still had maps and classes that demanded rushing. It balanced out the pacing of the game. And when MW2 had maps and classes designed for defensive gameplay, they did not try and keep people alive for any amount of time at the beginning of their lives. They just had death streaks. And I also think that MW2 still had maps that had good flow design, whereas most Ghosts maps seem very poorly planned out. But again, that is all in a future commentary, so stay tuned. But suffice it to say, for now, that I do not think 6v6 works on Call of Duty this year, and so I've gotten the Xbox One, which along with the PS4 has the only working Ground War playlist. It doesn't exist on the pre-gen consoles, and there's only like 28 people in the playlist on PC, so it doesn't really work. But on 9v9, Call of Duty actually is a decently fast-paced experience, but that means you're restricted to one playlist. And I was never a Ground War fan before Ghosts. You can check my Black Ops 2 gameplay. I was always a 6v6 guy, but in Ghosts, you will never see me play anything but Ground War, because 6v6 just feels like an extended search and destroy match without the excitement and tension of no respawning and 500 points per kill. And it also means you're restricted to like 3 or 4 maps. Prison Break, Siege, Chasm, Sovereign, I think that's it. And so really, it feels like a broken game because you don't have access to a majority of the game, because the majority of the game is a wet fart. They have 6v6 on Siege. Whose bright idea was that? They should take that map out of the 6v6 rotation altogether, because the result is that Call of Duty has lost one of its key advantages over Battlefield. The fast pace. Even on the 360 and PS3, Battlefield 4 domination is significantly more fast-paced than Call of Duty domination. Battlefield 4 Team Deathmatch and Squad Deathmatch are both much more fast-paced than Call of Duty TDM. Now granted, on the pre-gen consoles, Conquest, Obliteration, and Rush a lot of the time are too slow just because of the same reasons with Battlefield 3, the maps are still too big for 12v12. But on the new gen, every Battlefield 4 playlist is faster than Call of Duty's playlists. which wasn't the case a year ago. In terms of just never-ending kill or be killed action, COD had an edge due mainly to the simplicity and extremely small size of the maps with instantaneous respawning of course, and I thought it would always have that edge. Again, the simple, quick, and easy versus depth and variety, like one-night flings at parties versus year-long relationships. When done right, they're both pretty fucking dope. But this year, the one-night stand was just a dry handjob. This year, Infinity Ward shot themselves in the motherfucking foot. Now, saying that Battlefield 4 only wins because Ghost fails would be doing an injustice to Battlefield, because Battlefield topped COD in a lot of ways this year, and not just the areas where IW shit its pants. Levolution, obviously, is an area where Call of Duty was embarrassed this year. It wouldn't have been an embarrassment if COD hadn't tried to implement its own dynamic map events, but they did, and it just made them look so silly. Like, in Battlefield, I can run over an entire forest with a tank. I can blow up a tree and then use it for cover. And if I get pushed back, I can blow up another tree and then use that for cover. COD has the tree on Prison Break, where you shoot it and it falls over, which I think completely embodies and signifies how pathetic and intellectually devoid the IW team is at this point. Because one team always spawns right in front of that tree, right? And people want to use it immediately to get to the top of that hill, so within 10 seconds of the match starting, every match, it's already been shot down before anyone has even seen an enemy. So it's completely pointless because it doesn't actually ever change the dynamics of a match. They could have just put the tree already fallen over and the result would literally be exactly the same. The only change it brings about is that one player wastes 3 bullets at the beginning of the match. It feels like the only reason it's there was so they could show it off in the trailer. Now, when Battlefield 4 showed off its collapsing skyscraper, within a week Call of Duty announced that it too had a falling skyscraper. And this is more false advertising on their part, because I was led to believe that the map would structurally rearrange every time it fell. But it doesn't. I can see shit moving outside of the map when it falls, but the map stays the same as far as I can tell. And I know someone's gonna comment saying like, oh, this door gets shut off or this wall has a hole in it now, but I mean, when you compare something like that to the Shanghai skyscraper collapsing, it's laughable. I laugh out loud at how pathetic Freefall's dynamic event is. Now, I know the KEM strike, or the Chem strike, whatever the fuck it is, sometimes completely changes a map. On Sovereign, when the gas comes out, that's the most obnoxious thing I've ever experienced, especially because it affects both teams equally regardless of who called it in. And on other maps like Strike Zone, where shit is completely different after it's called in, I think this was incompetent on IW's part. Instead of dedicating all that memory and processing power to a deformed double map that people are gonna see very rarely, I mean, I've seen maybe 3 Chem strikes called in total in a solid 60 hours of gameplay, why not just use all that extra processing power to make the original map extra cool? But really, it's not just the big Levolution events like the skyscraper, the dam breaking that are a lot of fun for me. It's the small stuff, closing the metal gates on the windows so people can't get through, going up the elevators, hiding in all the cargo containers. These all end up generating entirely new types of gunfights, like when an enemy squad is hiding in those cargo containers and they keep spawning in there and they're pouring out and you're trying to clear them out, but when you get too close they open up the back and come around and get you, and then you get an incendiary grenade in there and they all burn to death. Or when you and 3 guys are in an elevator going up to the roof trying to take it back from a bunch of camping dicks, and you reach the top and the door opens and there's like 3 people outside the door and there's 3 of you in there and you spam rockets and shoddy, and it's just like who's the last man standing after the smoke clears. And then one of you survives and takes cover behind the elevator, so you guys will spawn back on the roof on you, and then the enemies that are left on the roof realize they're being overrun, so they shoot the glass out from under their feet and they fucking James Bond into the room below and surprise attack another group of your teammates, and it just goes on like that. And then obviously you have the destructible environment, which by itself would still shit on COD's dynamic events. You can collapse any single building and it would still be a more significant event, both aesthetically and in how it changes the battle dynamics, than any COD player activated event. In Battlefield, they really do create dynamic gameplay. Like, every match is its own action movie. The dynamic events can be used strategically. There's some tactical thought involved with using them or trying to get around them. Whereas with COD, it's not a dynamic event. On most maps, I bet most people don't even know what changes. Like on Tremor. When the Tremor hits, a telephone pole lands on a car somewhere. I haven't seen it happen, that's just what I'm told. And then even the kind of cool stuff like the gas station falling over on Octane, because it's so easy to activate and because it only happens once, it's like with the Prison Break tree. It happens once in the very beginning of the match, usually before anyone has even gotten a kill, and a lot of the time one team won't even see it happen, and so it's just a part of the map. COD's dynamic events are literally just there for the sake of being there. So they can say we have dynamic gameplay too, but when you compare the dynamic events of each, it makes Call of Duty look silly. Like, I really think they would have been better off just leaving that shit out. Now, if we look at graphics, I think it is now clear that Call of Duty needs a new engine. Alright, on the consoles, which is where the big profits are, sorry PC players, they have been shitting on Battlefield graphically because Battlefield was stuck at 30 frames per second in its lowest graphic settings. But on the new consoles, that is no longer the case. At 720p and 60 frames per second, Battlefield is a better looking game than any Call of Duty in every way, period. It is eerily similar to real life, and in terms of proximity to reality, it is the best looking game I've ever seen. Side by side, it makes Call of Duty look like a cartoon. And there's no way Call of Duty can beat those graphics on their current engine, which is the same engine they've been using for like almost 10 years now. So taking all this into account, I do think Battlefield wins this year decisively, and frankly, to beat it, Call of Duty is going to have to implement dramatic changes. It benefited heavily from the fact that Battlefield and other games were so nerfed and capped on the pre-gen consoles. COD has had this kind of monopoly because the consoles couldn't handle anything better. But that is no longer the case going forward. The formula that they've been using for the last 10 years is officially outdated. I think they undoubtedly have to bring in better graphics, bigger matches, and destructible environments. That's the big one. Otherwise, people are going to continue to ask, especially once the console transition is over, what does COD have that Battlefield doesn't? And that question is very elusive now that Battlefield has 60 frames per second at 720p and 32 and 64 player matches. COD has to be able to say, here's the thing we have that Battlefield does not have, or that Battlefield did not already do better. To do that, they have to build a new engine. There's no way around it, but that's expensive. And I'm starting to suspect that maybe Activision is ready to pull the plug on Call of Duty. They are just milking it for what it's worth. Destiny is Activision's next big title. Supposedly, they are confident it can be $1 billion franchise, and the thing is, a publishing studio doesn't necessarily want to pour huge sums of money into two shooters of the same genre, essentially spending millions on advertising and production just to be competing with itself. And a new engine is going to be very, very expensive, so they might just be done with the franchise. Release another couple of Call of Duties on the same 10-year-old engine until it is no longer cost effective, and then just pull the motherfucking plug. So we'll see, people. It is a rapidly changing industry these days, and I'll be trying to keep up with it and keep you guys filled in on the deets as always. Please remember to rate. This is Batman signing out.